Welcome to the Fab Life Project podcast. I'm your host, Amber J. Adams. This show is all about asking the questions that challenge us to elevate our lives, while also having the conversations and discussions that empower us to show up as who we really are. We're on a mission to help millennials live courageously and intentionally. Let's get it. Hey everybody, this is Amber and this is the Fab Life Project podcast. Welcome. This is episode 3. So this episode is one that I have felt really called to make, but operating in the space of transparency and honoring my word of the year, I feel very a little vulnerable, I would say, in navigating into this episode, but it is a topic that is probably always on my mind in some shape or form, but I wanted to, speak a little deeper today. So today we're going to be talking about grief. I'm calling this the grief episode. So for those of us who have or are grieving the loss of a person, we know that the experience changes you. And what I've realized in time is that you can use the energy of that loss and that grief to power you through a part of your lifestyle design journey by letting it guide you toward finding um, or attributing meaning in some way. This isn't something that happens overnight, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get deeper into the episode, but it is possible. So, a quick disclaimer before we jump in. This is a time to remind you I'm not a therapist. My background is not in therapy or mental health. When I'm speaking today, I speak from my own personal experiences, some research that I have done, but not the same as being a therapist by any stretch of the imagination. And I totally believe in the power of therapy, especially when it comes to learning how to navigate a massive life change that is experiencing an event that causes grief. Yeah, really any event that causes grief, because there can be so many things. But today we're going to be speaking in particularly about losing people. So, a little bit of backstory and why this episode feels so important for me to do and how it really relates to lifestyle design. So, we know that for the last 2 years, we have all really been going through a major grief event. Some of us, of course, more intensely than others. I'm speaking about the pandemic and really just this experience that we've all been having of seeing death in a major way, seeing it in a massive event, losing so many people over the last 2 years, and having these deaths be something that feels um, in a lot of ways preventable. Shocking, of course, because so many things were sudden, brutal in the way in which they've happened, and that you've had people who have died and your loved ones haven't been able to be present, or just the amount of hopelessness and helplessness that surrounds losing people in this way. But also for those of us, I speak from a place of being what I kind of call a grief OG, an OG in the grief game. So something to know about me: when I was 14 years old, really about almost a month before my 15th birthday, I lost my mother unexpectedly and tragically. Um, we were in a car wreck and she was killed. So, as you can imagine, this was a really big, kind of remains, I would say, the big, like a lot of things have happened in my life, good and bad, I would say. But this one was one where I can look back or look at it and think and see how, I had one version of my life, what I like to call version A, and suddenly, in the blink of an eye, I was thrust into version B of my life. And so, as a child, grief was pretty numbing, and I've since learned that when you are a kid, in particular, experiencing grief, your brain kind of shields you from a lot of the pain. You kind of mostly search for ways to return to a sense of normalcy in your life. And while I have some key memories from that time, it's very difficult for me, and not because it's difficult from a feelings perspective, but just from a memory perspective, to tell you what my day to day life was like during that time. Um, I would say that a lot of my deeper memories don't really pick up for me until college. So a couple of years later, after my mom died, it just kind of feels like my brain really just shielded me from the depths of that pain. So my grief journey has been shaped by that, and shaped by the fact that it started in childhood, which I would imagine or have read that it's very different than someone as an adult who, experiences grief a little later on in their life. Because at that point in time, you're also dealing with the business side of grief, or what they call the business side of grief, meaning actually having to make arrangements and, all those things that come along with death, that sometimes you don't even know about until something happens. But it's very different when you're a child and those expectations are not on you. So for me, as an adult, I started to really kind of come into a different understanding and reconciling of my life in the shadow of grief. Because although, my mom has been gone, or has, you know, she died almost 22 years ago, the impact of her death and the grief that comes with that is still very, very present in my life. And I like to say on some days it is small, like a tiny butterfly sitting on my shoulder. On other days, it might feel like a 10-pound weight on my heart. And then on some days, the ones that I call the really griefy days, that I will say for those listening who might be a little bit newer, who aren't, an OG in the grief game quite yet, those are the days that feel like massive waves are barreling over you. And as time goes on, you do have less of those days, but they happen every now and then. And again, because what I've learned and what you'll see is that you never get over this type of loss. It just doesn't happen. But you do learn to live with it. And this episode today is about what I found, which is that it is possible in time, and I put a lot of emphasis on in time, to harness that energy, that grief, for something good in your life. And this isn't saying that, you make sense of the loss, depending on what your framework is that you have used to kind of navigate the loss. You may approach it from different ways, because we all do, we all have to. But I'm not saying that you ever make sense of the loss, that you're ever able to attribute this happened because XYZ, because that's just really difficult. Even though our brains, sometimes it feels like they want something to grasp onto. But I'm saying that the actual residual effect of the event, the grief, the mourning, um, that's something that you do in time, I feel, have a little bit of power to really shape there. So, how has, grief, or how has it changed my life in the big determination to really kind of live my life on my own terms and really be, inspiration for my lifestyle journey? So I will say that it took me a while to harness the energy of YOLO, you only live once, into something that felt less erratic and more intentional and purposeful. Because I do think, one side of that is that YOLO, kind of jumping forward and just doing things, but doing them in a way that is a bit more with a frantic energy versus an energy that has been calmed and harnessed. And in fact, I would say that I had to go for, or I had to do a bit of a reframe. I made the decision to, on the days when I could, rather think about grief and loss in terms of what I could do with it, um, actively, what I could do with it. And I had to start with the courage or take that tiny step. I've talked about courage and tiny steps of asking myself what felt intentional and purposeful. So some of the questions I asked myself when I was trying to think about how I could allow grief to really shape my journey or how I could let it have an input on how my journey was shaped, were what are the dreams I held? That was a question for me. What are the dreams that I hold on to? And what did I want to prioritize most? Of course, because I've learned that grief feels long. Life doesn't necessarily feel long, and it definitely feels a little unpredictable. So, finding that courage to really fight my personal grief battle and believing, for me, it was really finding or coming to a space where I could believe that planning is still worthwhile in a world that I now know very acutely can have tragic things happen to anyone at any time. And I had to come into the maturity of planning for what I want to do, for planning and thinking about what is lighting me up in my soul and not giving in to the fear, um, or the demons that kind of remind me how random it can all be. And therefore, why spend time planning when it is all random? And kind of go into this space of allowing grief to help me see that planning is something that is worthwhile. That was a personal journey that I had to fight. And, as you're listening to this and reflecting, especially if you're someone who has, lost someone recently, or maybe, it's been a bit of time since it's happened, but really kind of thinking about what is your courageous first step in thinking through how you can allow the grief to really propel you forward or push you to take some steps forward that maybe you haven't done quite yet. So for me, I gave in finally. It took some years. Don't let the composure fool you here. It took some years of me figuring this out, but I finally kind of gave in to letting it catapult me forward. When I first learned about the concept of lifestyle design, I kept hearing all of these stories of people, for whom their impetus towards this new way of life and curating their life more intentionally was about shitty jobs and shitty bosses. And obviously, that's super important. But I had to give into the space of knowing that it was always going to be a bit deeper for me. Because once you know that life can be done in a moment's notice, intimately in that way, it really can light a fire under you to make the most of the time that you presume you have and to seek a different type of joy in the journey that is life. So for me, I started doing things that I had always wanted to do, things that I remembered that my mother wanted to do that I was curious about. So this is really when, as I started navigating into my lifestyle design journey and kind of coming more into the knowledge of what that could mean for me, I started traveling more. That was a big thing for me, traveling solo out of the country. I have left jobs that made me miserable, and I survived moments of self-loathing, especially in my early and mid 20s as I went through some things. By remembering that my journey could be something deeper and different if I went for it, and that I could design ways to use the energy of my grief and the new landscape of my life to go, do, and be much more than I probably would if my heart and my mind had not been shaped by such a deep loss. So, how can you allow grief to inspire you? We're at that part in our journey today where I want us to turn inward and really kind of reflect. Um, how can you allow your grief to inspire you? So I think one of the most important things I can say is that you don't have to be in a rush to contextualize your experience immediately. I know we live in this productivity society where we tend to try to put everything into the context of productivity. And while I do believe you can read things that are helpful and of course go to therapy that is helpful or listen to things that give you ideas, such as this episode right here, this is truly something that you have to do at your own pace, at a pace that feels, almost like kind of learning how to exercise after a long time of sitting on the couch. You don't just get up and start running, you walk first. And this is, a moment where you're kind of figuring out what is that walk that you're taking before you can get to the run, and what does that run even look like. So I think that the first glimmers of hope or the first ideas about how you can use your grief to really spark your lifestyle design journey is by thinking of ways you can honor the person that you lost through experiences you had with them, or maybe experiences that they wanted to have, or things that you wanted to do together. So that's a good starting point. And it's a difficult starting point because it's always hard. Like, it's very hard for me to think about things that, my mom wanted to do that she didn't get to do. And on my best days, I think that she's living them through me. And on the sad days, I just feel sad about it and I sit with that sadness and I allow it to just be the emotion that I have. But when I am on those good days and I'm able to think about this from that lifestyle design aspect, I do think that my mom, she did want to travel and she didn't get to, but she had this dream of our family traveling around the country in a Winnebago. And when I was a kid, we would go to these, Winnebagos. I don't know if people use that word anymore, but we kind of think of it as almost like van life. Like, my mom was so ahead of her time. It's not even funny. But we would go to these trade shows for Winnebagos and we would go and tour all of these kind of camper vans. And, I didn't know it at the time, but she was teaching me how to dream and manifest and giving me something to spark my creativity around how I would want to build my life, or, making it okay to have these more expansive thoughts around what my life could really look like and how I could really build it out. And so I would say, for you all, that's a good place to start. Or how about I say that's the place we're going to start today, with finding that glimmer of hope and thinking about something that really honors the person that you lost and the person you feel, deeply connected to. What is that thing that makes you think about something that you would want to step into as part of your lifestyle design journey? Like, I have a friend who lost a parent, and one of the things for her was that, I believe either her mom always told her or said that she could see her living in New York City. And so that became a piece of her journey. Or, a friend who lost her parent. And for her, that has catapulted her to get involved in more things that are around um, bereavement and childhood loss, because that was something that she experienced in the form of her, connecting with organizations and doing 5Ks and raising money and getting into different things that really support children who are navigating a loss. So there's so many different ways that you can do that. And I just say, take your time going deep into these things. But I hope that as I am wrapping up this episode, that you're feeling a spark of something that might inspire you in time, maybe not today, maybe it's tomorrow, maybe it's many tomorrows from now, to think about how your grief can kind of, I won't say catapult you, but it can move you along. So as I was searching this episode, I came across this quote that I really liked and that I wanted to share. And it's, although grief for my dead will always be a part of me, I have learned to embrace sorrow along with happiness. In fact, that shadow of sorrow makes the light so much brighter. Yeah, I thought that was a profound quote. So I hope this episode has been helpful for you. If you're in the midst of a grief storm, know that I am deeply sorry. You are seen, you are heard, and your loss deserves to be reflected and respected. And so, outro, of course, my outro here today. I want to say that I dedicate this episode to my mother. I am who I am because she was who she was. And I hope that she continues to guide me always. So thank you all so much for listening today. Our next episode, as a person, you always feel, especially as a person navigating grief, you always feel that pressure to kind of put the bow on everything. But today I'm just going to kind of leave with it all on the table, step into that vulnerability of doing so and say our next episode, which I have in mind, we'll see where it takes us. But yeah, thank you so much. Peace. Thank you so much for hanging with me today here on the Fab Life Project podcast. I'm super excited to have your support. Hit that subscribe button. And if you want to connect more with me and see what we have going on between episodes, then find us all over the socials. We're on the Pinterest, on TikTok, on Instagram. I might even tweet a little bit. We'll see what I get into. But thank you so much for hanging with me. Talk to you next time. Bye.